The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Will tuition-free training and a reduced education requirement get Ontario the policing it needs? We'll consider such recent policy moves made by the province tonight. Then, those pressing for all sorts of action turn to online petitions to make their case. We'll ask how effective those really are. It's Monday, May 15th, and that's next on The Agenda. Premier Doug Ford has said Ontario is enduring a, quote, growing tide of crime, requiring many more police officers. That has apparently motivated a new policy that removes the requirement for post-secondary education for new recruits, adds to how many can undertake basic training, and makes tuition free. Is that the way to go to get more and better policing in Ontario? Let's ask. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, Timothy Bryan. He's assistant professor of sociology at the University of Toronto. In the nation's capital, former police officer Gregory Brown, now an adjunct research professor at Carleton University. And here in our studio in the provincial capital, Mark Baxter, president of the Police Association of Ontario. And Mark, it's good to have you here in our studio. And to Timothy and Gregory and Points Beyond, we thank you for joining us as well. You heard me in the introduction say what some of the new ideas are that the province of Ontario is bringing forward. And I guess I'd like to start. Gregory, you're an ex-cop. Let's start with you. What do you think of what the Premier and his government have up their sleeve?
Well, I went to the Ontario Police College in 1985, and so I think the free tuition would certainly be a attractive incentive to getting some people into the profession of policing. But more to the point, I was very surprised by the announcement. I'm still waiting to hear the underlying rationale. In my opinion, we were moving on a trajectory towards requiring more education than less. At my university, Carleton, myself and a couple of other professors just a couple of years ago were exploring the possibility of introducing a 4-year degree program in police sciences, and that would be perhaps a requirement for a recruit to enter into the profession. It's very similar to what they were doing in the United Kingdom. So surprise was my response, and skepticism, I guess. As an academic, we're paid to be skeptical, so I'm waiting to hear the underlying rationale.
Timothy Bryan, what's your take?
Yeah, I was similarly surprised and concerned by this announcement. And I think what concerned me the most about the announcement was this sort of, the way in which post-secondary education or higher education was kind of framed in the announcement as something that is perhaps unnecessary or not useful to new recruits. What we know is from existing research is that better educated officers, as well as officers with greater experience, with better training, perform better. They're better colleagues. They have better interactions with the community. They're in a position to really address the public safety concerns that many communities have. And so to move in a direction that is counter to what we know to be to produce more positive policing outcomes is quite concerning. And to frame that as, to some degree that higher education is somehow not essential, not necessary, or adds little value to the actual work of police is quite concerning.
Mark, your initial take.
Our take is that this is removing barriers from potential recruits. It maintains the status quo. The current practice in Ontario is that if you want to be a police officer, you're required to have a minimum of a grade 12 education. The change is to an act that is not yet in place. And so what this change has done is removed a future barrier to policing. We know that across Canada, there's a labor shortage, and we're trying to attract the best possible recruits and the best candidates that we can to be police officers. And so, by maintaining the status quo, it will remove a future barrier for someone that would have a requirement to have post-secondary.
Can I just get you to speak to the comments that Timothy and Gregory both pointed out? Namely, I think it's unusual, it's more unusual nowadays to require less education for a job than more education. By taking away the obligation to get some kind of post-secondary education, How does that make sense?
Well, for us, we don't see this as, we're going to start hiring, uneducated people right out of high school, or we're going to hire someone that's 18 or 19 years old. Generally, what happens and what is happening now is this removes a barrier for someone who leaves high school and goes straight into the workforce. And then they accumulate all kinds of life skills, whether it's through a trade or something else in their work life. And then they decide later in life, oh, maybe I want to be a police officer. And so this removes a barrier of saying, okay, well, you didn't have the means to go to post-secondary school, perhaps right out of high school. You went straight into the workforce. Well, now it puts a barrier in place that someone who's later in life, with bills to pay, maybe and a mortgage, perhaps they have family, they now have to go and acquire some post-secondary education in order to be a police officer. So it really helps us cast as wide a net as we can to attract the best candidates possible.
As I get Gregory and Timothy to follow up on your answer, let's acknowledge they are both attached to post-secondary institutions. But do you think, Gregory, do you think that apropos of Mark's point, it could be a barrier to require a post-secondary degree before you get to put that uniform on?
I appreciate Mark's perspective. I just don't agree. I think to Timothy's point, it's demonstrably apparent that a better educated officer does better in the field, leads to more positive police-citizen interactions, and it's been particularly questionable over the years that such an important aspect of our society, policing, where there's so much controversy, bad interactions have massive repercussions, that it's one of the few professions where we don't require a university-specific degree program. When you think of other professions, nursing, teaching, architecture, accounting, social work, dentistry, engineering, law, medicine. I could probably think of more. Timothy might have some others on his list as well. I just think that this is a natural progression as we evolve as a society and as the role of policing in society expands exponentially. Policing is now in the social work field, in the psychiatry field. We talk about de-escalating people in mental health crisis, dealing with people that are suffering from substance dependency. And so the job has gotten much more complex than when I started walking the beat in 1985 in Vanier, where that was a very simple mandate, to now a mandate that spans all kinds of different areas and requiring further education that's not delivered at the Ontario Police College or in field training.
Timothy, what about it? Is there an argument to be made that the requirement of a post-secondary degree could constitute a barrier to getting more people into a police service somewhere?
I don't think that's the case. I don't think it's a barrier. And to be fair and to be clear, is that many police services have already moved to require some level of post-secondary education as a minimum requirement for consideration of applications in their service. So that standard in many ways is already the case formally in some police services or informally in the hiring process. So those candidates that apply to police services that only require a high school education, those candidates that have higher levels of formal education fare much better in the hiring process already. So it seems to me that police services see a value in post-secondary education because they are already prioritizing post-secondary education when they're making hiring decisions. If there is, in fact, a concern about barriers, perhaps the solution there is to increase access to post-secondary education. Because that would, in fact, eliminate some of the barriers if those are the concerns.
Let me put that to Mark. What about the idea of, if post-secondary is a barrier, knock down the barrier to post-secondary?
Well, yeah, that's certainly one solution. I think right now, we can't lose sight of the fact that the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police recently said that 10% of recruits at the police college don't have post-secondary education. So we're not talking about a large group of individuals that are becoming police officers that don't have post-secondary education. And I don't know what makeup of the 10% are, but I would, anecdotally, I from my experience, I would say that, those are most likely people who have been in the workforce, perhaps been in the trades, maybe been in the military, who have gained life experience and then now have shifted their focus to policing.
Can I ask you a personal question?
Yeah.
Have you got a post-secondary degree?
I have a diploma I have a 2-year diploma from Fanshawe.
Okay, that's a post-secondary, diploma.
Yes.
Do you think it has been useful to your being a better cop?
Honestly, I don't. I think that I think the training that we receive, I think it's helpful. I think it helped me in the early stages, certainly at the police college. But it's a very intensive training program and highly regulated that you go through at the Ontario Police College. It's now up to 13 or 14 weeks. Plus, you have regular yearly training as well as ongoing training with whatever the latest that's happening in policing is. And so, I think, in policing, we really are constantly educating our police officers. And, it's a lifelong learning profession where you're always learning the latest updates and the latest training on trends or what's happening in policing. As an example, the opioid pandemic, which we know is so tragically killing so many people across this country on our streets. When I went to police college in 2005, we weren't learning about opioids or drug overdose deaths because it wasn't something that we were dealing with. It's something that evolved over time, and as that issue came to the forefront, we trained our police officers on how to respond to those types
So they
of
are
calls.
getting training on that now?
Certainly.
I want to go to Timothy on that. How good would you say the current way we train police officers rolls out?
Well, I think to assume that the education that's provided at the Ontario Police College or in-service training, as good as it may be, is sufficient to address the kinds of complex public safety concerns that are facing many, communities in Ontario. I think it's perhaps a little naive. What we know is that police training over the last decade has had to be revamped because it has been proven to be ineffective at responding to certain kinds of incidents. We know that the kinds of communities and the kinds of places in which policing is taking place, not just individuals who struggle with mental health or addiction issues or people in crisis, but individuals with language barriers, individuals who may have come to reside in Ontario from a vast array of backgrounds. What you get in a post-secondary education is the kinds of really meaningful and important transferable skills that allow you to do those multiple angles of that job, whether it's communication, understanding, analysis, problem solving, understanding what you don't understand, right? And you can then take those skills and use them to learn and continue your development as a police officer. And I think the point also has to be made here is that having a post-secondary education, having higher levels of formal education is an asset to police officers, period, to their own career development, to their own progression. And so what I think here, again, that is most concerning is to have this debate about whether a post-secondary education is valuable or not is really, the wrong discussion to be having. The question is, how do we equip police officers with the kinds of skills that they need to effectively meet the public safety challenges communities face?
All right,
That's the question.
let me pick up on that question if I can and put it to Gregory, because he obviously has, based on his experience, determined that there is a place for a bachelor's degree in policing, which he, I think, told us earlier he's working to get such a program in place at Carleton. What would that kind of a program offer, Gregory, that you think the current training for police officers misses?
Well, I think one of the significant benefits would be we would have 4 years to assess the suitability of a candidate. They would go through a degree program. They would learn a very holistic approach to policing. They would learn in depth about various complexities in today's police world, in dealing with people struggling with mental health, in actual use of force training that would incorporate depolicing. We would, in my conception of the way we would roll this out, there would be a theoretical approach, but also, as compared to a lot of university programs, a much more applied approach. So I would like to see officers extremely proficient in use of force. This is an area where police get into a lot of trouble. When you have an officer, and I'm sure Mark, in his experience with the Brantford Police, I don't know if it coincides with mine, but use of force training after you leave Aylmer is maybe 8 hours a year. To be proficient 100% of the time at 10 out of 10 in highly stressful situations is just impractical. I relate often anecdotally to golfers, which I'm sure many of the audience can relate to. To expect to not touch a golf club for 365 days and then go out and shoot par is impossible. And so part of our program would be training officers to a very high level of use of force proficiency, where they're applying it professionally as opposed to out of emotion when you're angry with someone. I wanted to pick up on one of Mark's earlier points about access. If the Premier is wanting to make tuition at the OPC free, what about making a degree program in policing free at a university? I think that would be a phenomenal opportunity. If we're actually having a problem attracting people into policing, getting a free 4-year degree would be a tremendous incentive to bring people into the profession. One last point just on use of force. Many of my officers, I supervised a platoon of officers in downtown Ottawa. When their use of force date would come about, the terminology useless force was often used. The training is not at a high level. It's been watered down over the years because you can't have half of your workforce off on workman's compensation because they've got dislocated shoulders or sprained wrists or broken nose. So the force is at a very low level. It's offered, as I said, once a year, and it's just not satisfactory.
Okay, a lot to react to there, Mark. I'll give you a chance now.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would disagree with the characterization that around use of force and people being injured. We have to remember that use of force incidents happen, and I'm not armed with the stats today, but in a very, very, very small percentage, less than 1% of police interactions with the public result in a use of force incident. And so, putting all kinds of focus on additional use of force training, I would suggest isn't really a good use of police training time. Where we have turned focus to in police training and over the last couple of years, which I think is really important, is speaking with people that are in crisis. And we know that police are the first call when someone is someone is emotionally disturbed and they're in crisis. The fallback is to call the police because we're the service that's there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I think we've done a good job of training our officers. There's always room for improvement, but we've done a really great job of police officers in this province being trained on dealing with people in emotionally charged situations, dealing with people that are in mental health crisis. And, and it also in terms of, the recruitment, back to the recruitment of police officers that don't have post-secondary. Again, small percentage of police officers
I get that
we're talking about.
Let me take you back to first principles here, though. The Premier's government brought this forward because, in their view, we have a budding police shortage problem in this province. Is that, in fact, the case?
Yes, it is. Like the rest of the country, we have a labor shortage. And in policing, staffing levels across the province are at a crisis level. And it has been getting to that for a number of years now.
Crisis level, meaning we're going to run out of cops if we don't do something?
Meaning that every day in every community, platoons that are working are running short. Often we are staffing our police departments in every police department across this province with officers working on their day off on overtime to adequately staff our police departments. We are really at a critical level. It's not as much, in your face in the media the way that some of the other professions have been, but our members, are going to work every day to ensure the safety and security of everyone in their community, but they're doing so short-staffed and often on their days off or having their shifts extended so that they can have adequate coverage.
Let me put that to Timothy, because we did check in with the London Police Service, and apparently 10% of their frontline officers are on stress leave right now. So is Mark right when he says we've got a serious shortage right now?
Well, I think that, the number of officers that we have currently deployed in the province is actually just one part of the equation of public safety, right? There's an issue about how many officers do we need to adequately meet the public safety challenges. But the question here, I think, in this debate, in this discussion, is what kinds of people do we need to hire with what kinds of experience to be able to meet those challenges? It's not just enough to have more people on the streets. It's important to have the right people on the streets, because when we respond more effectively to the calls that police receive, and they are more efficiently dealt with, and you form stronger relationships with communities, it makes policing overall much more efficient and much more effective. And so while there may be a concern about numbers of officers, that concern can't trump the quality of officers that you receive, because those things are actually tied. And if you have lower quality officers, that may in fact create more challenges to policing than simply having additional numbers. So I think that we need to have a much more nuanced conversation that doesn't rely simply on the arithmetic of policing. You know,
Mark,
if
you want to
numbers
come
are
back
up,
on this?
Yeah, Timothy, and I understand what you're saying, but one thing that's really important that can't get lost in this conversation is no one's talking about lowering the standards to hire police officers. We already
Could you not infer that was the case if you don't require a post-secondary degree or certificate?
No, because you don't require one now. And so we haven't changed. All we've done is change, all that's been changed is a future, something in a future act that's not in play yet. But the way the standard is now is grade 12, and no one is talking about reducing the requirements to become a police officer, because we still have very high standards for which we select police officers from, and those standards should remain high. What this does is ensures that the net is cast very wide for the group of potential candidates who will then enter into a pretty rigorous recruitment process.
Greg, you want to come back on some of this?
I have some concerns. The government clearly some years ago thought it was a good idea to implement a requirement for university education. It's now apparently backtracking. I'm not convinced that there's this tremendous shortage of applicants. I think at any major police service, they have literally thousands and thousands of applicant files in their human resources department. I completely agree with Mark's point. The police to population ratio in many jurisdictions, especially in the city I'm in, Ottawa, is horrific. I mean, they're way below levels that need to be deployed on the streets. That's not an issue, as Timothy alluded to, regarding quality of applicant. That's a whole other topic for a whole other show. We need to hire many, many more police officers to do the job effectively and to give officers, I had to order officers to stay after night shift to work half of the day shift because we had mandatory minimums on the street. And it's not surprising the numbers that you quoted, Steve, about the London Police Service. I mean, officers are burnt out. So we do need to hire more officers, but I completely agree with Timothy's point that we need to hire a better quality of officer than what would be contemplated if this is rolled out. I do a lot of research in the United States. In America, not only the educational standards, you could argue the slippery slope principle here have been diminished, but then the fitness standards have gone down. In the state of Missouri, I believe, they're waiving misdemeanor criminal convictions for applicants. I'm not suggesting that's going to happen in Ontario, but I think we're going in the wrong direction with this initiative.
And unfortunately, Greg, the days of having a large number of applications sitting in a box somewhere are gone. And I think Hamilton Police recently were quoted as saying that 2 years ago they received 1,900 applications and they were down 1,000 applications to the next year. And that's consistent to what we're hearing across the province from every police department, that the number of applicants are down. And so it is a challenge to staff our police departments. What
about Gregory's point that if they had followed through on their initial position that everybody should have a post-secondary degree or certificate or diploma, that gives you added time in which to, quote unquote, get the bad apples out of a system? You've got extra time to see whether somebody really does belong with a uniform on. Is that not a fair argument?
I think right now we've got such rigorous recruitment protocols in place and such tight guidelines for selecting police officers and rigorous background investigations that are completed. I don't see that having an impact.
Even on mental health issues?
Having much of an impact. If officers have mental health issues,
No, not them themselves. Do you think with the police training they get right now in Aylmer at the police college, they are adequately trained to deal with calls that require somebody in mental health distress them responding to?
So the training that officers receive for people dealing with people that are in crisis isn't just at the Ontario Police College. They leave the Ontario Police College, they go back to their police service, and they receive additional training. There are additional training courses available that many police officers take early in their career called CIT, which is Crisis Intervention Training, and it's a 3 or a 4-day program, training program specifically for police interacting with people that are in crisis. So there's
adequate?
lots of, it seems to be, there's lots of training available for officers.
I should get Timothy's view on that. The notion that a 3 or 4 day program on crisis intervention might be adequate to deal with the kinds of mental health issues police officers see in the streets these days. What's your view? Timothy, that's for you.
Yes. So, I mean, I think the answer to that question has already been answered by many police services in this province who have said for the last number of years, we are not the best organization or institution to respond to people in mental health crisis. This is why there have been initiatives that have been piloted to connect police with mental health professionals, police with nurses, because police have said themselves they are not the best equipped or the best trained to respond to individuals in crisis. So I'm not so sure that the position that was just presented is actually consistent with what police have been saying for years now. So I think the answer is no, they're not. And so, given the fact that mental health concerns may in fact continue to increase, and the volume of interactions between police and those in crisis may continue to grow, I think it's an imperative that the people who are on the front lines, who are responding, first responders to those calls, have as much training as they can, as much experience as they can, so that those outcomes are as positive as they can be.
And
Mark, you want to?
Yeah, Timothy makes a good point that I missed, and that is we have MCRT or mobile crisis response teams throughout the province, where we have a social worker or some other type of a mental health professional working in a police car with a police officer, and they are often the first ones deployed to calls where people are in crisis. The additional training that officers receive is because, first of all, they could be paired with the mental health worker that day where they're responding to someone in crisis. But often we know that the team, the MCRT team with the mental health worker, they may already be tied up. Maybe they're at the hospital or dealing with someone who's in crisis when a second call comes in, or a third call, depending on their community. And so officers that have received the training, and the CIT training is part of an ongoing training, yearly training that officers receive every year when they do a week long of block training throughout the year. But yeah, really important point about the police aren't the primary people that should be responding to people that are in crisis. We obviously have an important role to play when there's safety risks, when we've got people that are in crisis who have a weapon or pose a greater risk to the broader community. Certainly the police need to be part of those interactions, but having these mental health workers in police cars has been a really big advantage that's really making an impact in lots of our communities.
Okay, Gregory, I want to go to you with a somewhat different angle on the post-secondary requirements, and that is this. Do you think it's possible? Every police service in the province wants to get more diverse. Is it possible that by taking away this obligation, as it was intended to be, but will not now go forward, for a post-secondary degree or diploma or certificate, that you could actually tap into more immigrant communities and get better representation from different communities on police services going forward?
This is an area, Steve, where I don't have a lot of expertise, but I can tell you what I see on campus. We have very, very diverse universities. I don't know if Timothy would agree, but we have extremely diverse student populations that are pursuing degree programs right now. And so I'm not convinced that there's any kind of empirical argument that can support the idea that that by imposing a requirement for a degree, that it's going to limit the opportunities for new Canadians or marginalized communities to enter into the profession. I'll go back to my original point. If we want to waive tuition at the OPC, why not waive tuition in a degree program? I think that would be a tremendous opportunity to recruit people from diverse backgrounds and to lead to diminishing the shortage that Mark's alluded to that is happening in recruiting.
Timothy, what's your view on that?
Yeah, to suggest that eliminating a requirement for post-secondary education is somehow a diversity method, a method of increasing diversity, I think is a bit naive, right? Because this decision isn't about actually increasing the levels of diversity in police forces. This isn't an announcement that, that's being made by the provincial government saying, you know what, we are going to require a post-secondary education, but we recognize the need to further diversify our police forces. So if there are exceptional candidates that have real life experience that don't have a post-secondary degree, we may have carve-outs for those specific candidates, and we may have opportunities for them to get post-secondary degrees. If that was the announcement, then I think I would be much more receptive to the argument that this is about promoting diversity. But that is not the announcement. And those incentives are not being rolled out. And there isn't anything that's added to this announcement about increasing diversity in the police force. So in police forces. So I'm skeptical of that claim, to be at the very least.
Okay, I got about 30 seconds left here, and Gregory, I want to give it to you because you have heard the call among some community groups that there is really no place for a police officer on a university campus. That has been the hope of some community groups. Here are you, attached to a post-secondary institution, a former police officer yourself. What do you think of those calls?
I'm not pleased with that, Stephen, and that's why the initiative that we were exploring at my university was set aside. Many professors signed a petition. There was a movement after some controversial episodes to ban police officers from campus. I'm hoping that will be reconsidered in the cold light of day when cooler heads prevail. I mean, if we have a problem in policing, the idea of banishing potential police officers or serving police officers from campus is not going to remedy the situation. I think it's a knee-jerk emotional response that wasn't well thought out. I certainly disagree with that. I'm very proud of my work in policing. I'm very proud of my work in the academic world. I mentor many, many students that are very interested in going into policing for all the right reasons. And so I hope that comes to an end.
That's our time. To be continued, as they say, going from right to left on your screen. That was Gregory Brown, Carleton University. In the middle of that shot, Mark Baxter, President, Police Association of Ontario, and Timothy Bryan, Assistant Professor, Sociology, U of T. My thanks to the three of you for coming on to TVO tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For almost as long as there's been an internet, there have been online petitions demanding action big and small. It's part of a long democratic tradition to have the voice of the people heard. Do they actually work? Or do they just add to the noise and the spam in your inbox? With us to explore it all, in Perth, Australia, Skye Cruiser. She is a researcher and lecturer at Curtin University's School of Media, Creative Arts and Social Inquiry. In Brooklyn, New York, Kajal Odedra, Head of Global Communication at Change.org. And in our nation's capital, Natalie Appleyard, Socioeconomic Policy Analyst at Citizens for Public Justice. And it's great to have you three on our program tonight. Kajal, I want to start with you because your organization, Change.org, proclaims it is the largest online petition platform in the world. So why don't you explain to our viewers and listeners how the process works, how you go from deciding on what to petition, how to create it, and then how to make it happen.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, the tool of the petitions is old as the internet, but it's also as old as democracy itself. It's one of the most powerful civic tools that we've had to hand as citizens. And what Change.org has done is made it faster, easier, and more effective for any individual to have their voice heard. Around the globe now, we've got over 500 million people using the tool. In Canada, it's 15 million, so that's 1 in 3 of the citizens. And really, how to do it, our mission is to make it as effective and easy as possible for everyone to have their voice heard and to realize that they can change the local community or the policies in the countries that they live in, that their voice really matters. And so our tools are trying to make it as easy as possible. So really, it's up to you, whatever you want to start the campaign on. But people are doing it. We're like our agenda is to make it as accessible as possible, and stop activism feeling like an elite sport, which I think sometimes it can. Often, if you look around the decision makers in the countries that we live in, they're a homogenous group. They've got a very specific lived experience, and we really believe that we need a diversity of thoughts and life experiences shaping the world around us.
Skye, petitions have, of course, existed before the internet existed, but they've, of course, taken off in a massive way ever since the creation of the internet. Can you give us a sense about how things have evolved on the web over time?
Yes. So I think that the big point is it's much easier to set up a petition and to get visibility from it now that we have the web available to us. The trick there is gaining attention among all the noise. And the trick, of course, is also having an effective plan, asking the right people for change. There's no point sending a petition to the UN to get better pedestrian infrastructure at your local intersection. You need to ask your local council. And so it is making sure that you've got the knowledge to support whatever petition you put together.
Let me do a follow-up on that. How much, in your experience, how much bad petitioning goes on? As in, this is really, you may have 1 million signatures, but it's the wrong message for the wrong jurisdiction at the wrong organization, and therefore you've wasted your time.
I think it would be fascinating to do some research looking at the details on that. I think that there's certainly a lot of petitions that are not well thought out in terms of the specific policy changes or the specific changes they're asking for, but even those can be effective in their own way at raising broader awareness. The important thing to remember is that petitions can be useful in terms of the specific action they call for, but they can also be useful as a way of reaching more people, building a movement, starting to build connections, and getting people involved.
Okay, Natalie, let's do a real-life example here. You at Citizens for Public Justice, give us an example of an issue you cared about. You decided to create an online petition, you got it going, and you made something happen.
Right. Well, I would agree with what our other panelists have said in that petitions serve a variety of functions. And so in terms of the effectiveness, they can prove effective in a variety of ways. But in terms of direct policy change, I believe that petitions are very effective, again, both in putting something on the agenda for the first time, as well as moving it past the finish line, because what they're effective in doing is showing that there's sufficient mass public support for politicians who support what you're advocating for to move it along. And so what we found in our experience is that there are these particular moments, these particular windows where a certain policy is possible and you need something just to drive it over the finish line. So for us, that has looked like advocating for Canada's first national poverty reduction strategy. It has looked like increasing our commitment to climate change mitigation, both domestically, but also in terms of our international investments. So we've seen this effective in a number of ways. Recently, we've had some open letters that have been very effective in various provinces to ask the provinces to cancel their contracts with the Canadian Border Service agencies so that it's ending immigration detention. So we've seen success across a variety of issues for which Citizens for Public Justice advocates.
And let me do a follow-up with you, because you say your efforts have been effective. And what I want to know is, how do you know that? How do you know these things weren't going to happen anyway, regardless of your involvement?
Well, I wouldn't say that the petition makes anything happen that wouldn't without a lot of other organizing and work. So I do want to maybe qualify that statement. I think that petitions are a tool in our toolbox. But to see really transformative policy change, you need there's a whole host of other public education, government relations, organizing that goes on. So the petitions are a piece of that, and they're a great way, as Erin mentioned, to and Kajal mentioned too, in terms of increasing accessibility, in terms of making sure that the actual demands that are being brought forward are reflective of people's lived experiences and of people who are most impacted by these policy decisions, who are typically not among policy decision makers. So what we've seen is that petitions can be effective in providing specific language, specific terms. So there might be an idea or a policy shift that politicians are already on board with in some cases, or that perhaps they've learned about through your petition. And so you can provide the specific language, some of the specific considerations in terms of the design of that policy through those petitions. But again, it's never just the petition. There's always so much other work going on behind the scenes, so much organizing and then follow-up conversations afterwards. So we would say that a petition is effective if it generates really good follow-up discussions with policymakers, if we've seen that it's led to an increase in public engagement on the issue, if it shifts the public discourse. Those are all different ways that we would use to evaluate a petition being effective.
Okay, I want to drill down a little deeper on this issue of effectiveness. And for example, Kajal, you say on the Change.org website that your organization has seen almost 88,000 victories in 196 countries, which sounds like a heck of a lot of success, I've got to say. But I want to read for you this observation from an op-ed in one of Canada's newspapers called the National Post. And the headline on the thing is, "Why Petitions Are Almost Always a Staggering Waste of Time." Okay, here comes the quote. "It turns out Change.org has some extremely loose definitions of what constitutes a petition victory. One of the more egregious Change.org victory claims is that a petition was able to free Canadian pastor Hyun-Soo Lim from a North Korean prison. Suffice to say that North Korea doesn't care at all about petitions. In reality, Lim was freed after the visit of a Canadian delegation and came amidst a handful of concessions made by Pyongyang in advance of a summit meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un." Okay, Kajal, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think like you say, we see a lot of victories on the platform. We've calculated it to being one every hour globally, where we're seeing a victory. And frankly, it does work. And I think that that's why we end up getting, you'll get this strength of opposition around the tool because it is working. The way that victories are that work on the platform it is purely down to the petition starter when they declare their victory, which is why the whole tool is supposed to be about empowering the individual and the petition starter, and so it's important that they're able to control whenever they declare victory. In that particular example, I don't know the details of it, but the petition starter could have just simply marked it victory because the campaign was over. It's done. That what they were calling for had happened. But we see, for example, we've seen an incredible movement of campaigns to get rid of the tax on sanitary products happen all around the world with the use of petitions. And so this started in the UK, a petition calling for the end of what they called the tampon tax. That built up a lot of power. Then we started seeing sister campaigns started in countries around Europe. Those petition starters then started connecting with each other on WhatsApp and giving each other support, cheering each other on. Then we started seeing petitions in North America, state by state in the US, and basically slowly this was becoming a really incredible global movement with the power of the petition. What's really important, though, to clarify is the petition isn't the end in itself. It's a means to an end. And so, like the other panelists said, it's a tool. And really on change.org, what it's doing is you're capturing all of the people who care about an issue, and then you're using it as an organizing tool. So you're then able to communicate to the supporters and say, what should we do next? Who should we write to? When should we meet up? People organize demonstrations and public meetings with the use of a petition. And so I think that there's a bit of a misconception that people using petitions are, just clicking and then that's it. They don't do anything more. But actually, we're seeing petition starters use it as a community organizing tool, and it's just part of their movement building.
Well, it is. I'll grant you that. It's a wonderful thing to get people engaged on an issue, and if they actually can see some progress take place on the issue, they may have the sense that they were helpful in the advancing of that cause. But I do wonder, and I'll put this to Skye, I do wonder whether we need a sort of more independent set of criteria before we're able to determine, yes, we got this done, our petition was effective and or instrumental in making it happen. And to that end, I guess, you've heard this term before, Skye, slacktivism. It's become very easy for people to sort of click a box on a petition and say, I did my bit and help to move the yardsticks along. Is it really genuinely the case?
Well, a lot of my research focuses on social movements and how people achieve change in the world. And I'm going to give a very academic answer, which is to say it's always very complex. And almost any social movement, any movement for change, any of the big civil rights movement, the movement against apartheid, yes, it had people who were devoting their lives, putting their bodies on the line, spending years organizing things. But it also had people who took smaller actions, who engaged in things that we might now call slacktivism. People who might have physically signed a petition, who might have had a conversation with a friend to try to shift their viewpoint. People who might have gone to a single protest. And social movements, big shifts towards change, need those little moments as well as the big dedicated people's moments of struggle. And I think that we have a bit of a tendency to see things that happen online as necessarily less real and less important than things that happen in physical space.
And we shouldn't do that? Is that your position?
No, I mean, the reality is you can go to a protest, you can spend hours walking around in the sunshine, you can get arrested, you can do all kinds of really physical, rigorous things without achieving change. And similarly, you can do things that involve just sitting in front of a computer that goes a long way towards moving things forward on issues you care about. And so I think that what we need to do is we need to recognize that movements for change need all kinds of people doing all kinds of things. And sure, some of those things will be small, and we should look for ways to progress them into larger steps. But it's not necessarily slack. People are doing what they can when they can.
No, that's a fair point. And I don't, again, I don't want to diminish any activity or any engagement that people feel is worth whatever amount of their time is useful. But Natalie, again, I'm going to follow up with you on this issue of the people who make the petitions are then allowed to decide whether the petitions have been effective or victorious. I mean, I suppose I could say I'm conducting a magnificent interview here with the three of you and decide that it's been extremely successful, but I suspect that the 50 to 100,000 people who are watching this will have their own views on that and want to make up their own minds on that. So do we need some independent criteria to determine whether your efforts have, in fact, pushed the ball into the end zone, if I can use that metaphor?
Well, I think your own community is going to keep you accountable to that. So if you are communicating that, if you're communicating claims that you can't substantiate or that aren't being backed up, then I would expect that the people that, who have been engaging with you are either going to stop engaging or, they will find other groups to engage with. Again, I think sometimes the point is that perhaps you've just increased awareness about an issue. Perhaps you've engaged people who wouldn't be able to engage otherwise. Kajal mentioned the really critical importance of accessibility. And so I think, again, if there's a smaller organization like ours that are using petitions, again, we often work in coalition. So we just wouldn't have the credibility if we started making claims about petitions that we can substantiate.
Okay,
So
I take your point.
to explain that.
I take your point on that. And for the record, I do think this is going swimmingly, incidentally, just for whatever that's worth. Kajal, let me go to you, though, on this issue, and that is with all of the experience your organization has in the myriad petitions you have organized, what petitions on what issues, in your view, work best?
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I just wanted to add an extra point to the conversation we were just having, which is that it is just, we're the world's largest petition platform, and we analyze our data. We have been doing this for a long time, over 15 years now globally. And it's just not something, it's not a problem that we see where petition starters are declaring victory when there's no victory. There are other issues that arise from having an online petition platform, especially in countries where it is a little bit more precarious and a little bit more challenging to have your voice heard. But I just want to, just to say that it's just not something that we see. It's not really a real problem. On effective petition making, most powerful petitions, the ones that have become the most effective and do go on to win, are the ones that are doing three things. One, that they're using the power of storytelling. So taking somebody's experience, either their own or somebody that they know, and using that as a point of evidence, really, to say, this thing has happened and this needs to change. The other thing that we really see is persistence. They don't give up. The most effective petition starters I have worked with are the ones that are just really dogged. They're not going to give up. It's not just a one and done for them. They're going to keep on going for months, for years, if needs be. And then finally is that they're choosing the right decision maker and really honing in what is the ask. So if I, for example, care really deeply about climate change, if I was to start a petition to say, end climate change now, that's really, really worthy and a really important issue, but it's not really going to make a change, and it's going to be harder to mobilize a big audience around it. But what might be much more effective is to call on a supermarket chain to reduce their plastics. So having a really tangible ask and really being specific about who the decision maker is. A good example, actually, that's a petition that's just been taking off since the coronation of King Charles, is a petition that's got over 40,000 signatures for an Indigenous person to be put on the new banknote in Canada. And there you've got something really, really tangible. It might not change the world for Indigenous communities in Canada, but what it does do is it shows it's a symbolic campaign that starts a debate and starts a conversation around Indigenous communities. It teaches through its campaigning. And that's actually something that is quite interesting to me, is that people can learn. That people learn about the news through campaigning, and they become more educated, and so it also just spreads the awareness of how we're treating Indigenous communities in our countries.
Now, that's a fascinating petition. Do we know whether the Royal, I think they still call it the Royal Mint in Canada, do we know whether the Mint or the Minister of Finance, who will ultimately make the decision about who goes on the money, do we know if they're aware of this petition?
I don't, but I will tell you that we had a similar campaign in the UK about 10 years ago, and the Bank of England, a campaign to put a woman on the banknotes, because could you believe it that only 10 years ago we only had men on our banknotes in the UK, and the petition got signatures, and eventually the Bank of England changed the way that they, how they choose who goes on banknotes, and in that instance they put Jane Austen on. So I have high hopes for this one, and I think as long as the petition starter doesn't give up, I think it's very winnable.
Are you saying the Queen wasn't even on the banknotes in England?
Oh, no, but so in the UK, you had the Queen on every single banknote, but on the other side, you have a historic figure.
Gotcha.
And back then, it was all men.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay, Sky, to you on this. We heard climate change referenced in the last answer. Could you make us a bit of a list, which, in your experience, these are the issues that people really use these online petitions to try to advance?
I've seen everything. So, and of course, I'm working more in the area of people who care about climate change, who care about diversity, inclusion, thinking about how we deal with our colonial history in Australia. But of course, petitions come from all ends of the political spectrum. But it could be everything for asking for change from their local council, specific actions around climate change. I saw one that was asking for different advertising on cereal boxes. People who are asking for changes to international diplomatic relations that are utterly impossible, because there are so many, because it is so quick to start online petitions. Of course, there are many, many ways in which people fail to properly target their petitions. But with the right framework and the right guidance provided through organizations like change.org, by people also noticing what gets traction and what doesn't. I think both of the other panelists have talked about this issue of accountability and traction. People who start a petition and then realize that it fails after a few days because they've asked for something completely ridiculous have learned a lesson. That doesn't necessarily mean that they've entirely failed. It might just mean that next time they choose their topic a little better.
Great point. I want to thank the three of you for coming on to TVO tonight and informing us so much more about this phenomenon around the world. Sky Cruiser coming to us from Perth, Australia, Kajal Odedra from Brooklyn, New York, and Natalie Appleyard from our nation's capital. My thanks to you three. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Monday, May 15th, 2023. Is it time, as some in Parliament argue, to declare the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women a national emergency? We'll examine that tomorrow. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.